In 1853, the Japanese shogunate was rudely awoken from its centuries-long isolation by American ships, sent to enforce the free trade agreements just like the other Western powers have imposed on China over the preceding and coming decades. When the Meiji Restoration propelled the new Japan to new heights, doing away with obsolete traditions that held Japan back for many centuries. Industrialization helped Japan trample over dynastic China in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 95. However, this only caused the ire of all the European powers, which wished to be the only ones to impose their will upon the Chinese. Japan was able to protect its sovereignty and further encroachment by the West when Russian hegemony over Manchuria caused the Russo-Japanese War. Surprisingly, against all expectations, the Japanese Imperial Army had emerged victorious in 1905, causing the Russians to back down, giving up Port Arthur and half of the island of Sakhalin, paving the way to the annexation of Korea in 1910. However, anti-Western sentiment in Japan only grew as American mediation severely stunted the possible gains Japan could have gotten for itself. In the aftermath of the Great War, Japan was on the winning side of it. But the Japanese delegates' demands to treat peoples of all races as equals were ignored, adding fuel to the fire of anti-Western thought among Japanese people and intellectuals. In the years following the Revolution of 1911 and the outbreak of civil war in China, the Japanese state and army began looking at these territories of northern China with much greed and growing imperialist appetite. In 1931, the Mukden incident became a pretext to the Imperial Army invading the province of Manchuria, establishing the Empire of Manchukuo. By the early 1930s, the Japanese state was getting torn apart by internal factionalism trying to sway the emperor to legitimize their hold on power, the civilian government wanting to subdue the military, the army wanting to build an empire over China then strike at the Soviet Union, the navy wanting to be the primary power and have the army subdued, and the zaibatsus, industrial and corporate conglomerates, which wanted a suitable climate for business growth. As time passed, the rivalry, particularly among civilian, army and naval leaders, would more often than not result in assassinations of officials of all three factions. One particular faction that began gaining influence in Japan was the Kodoha faction, a faction of ultra-monarchists removing and killing anyone in the civilian government and military leaders who were opposed to them in any way possible. On February the 26th of 1936, the Kuroha committed to a proper attempt at a coup d'etat, even attempting to have the emperor speak out in support of their actions. However, their hope in the emperor was misplaced, as a regiment of the IJM was deployed to suppress the Kuroha coup attempt. The civilian government, for the time being, was safe. Even though the IJA was subdued at home, in Manchuria, the Kwantung army was growing restless, eventually overthrowing the local government in Mianjiang, establishing a military government under the reign of a puppet Mongol prince. While the civilian government attempted to stabilize things at home, the IJA reinforced the garrison in eastern Hebei. Little did the government know what for. In July of 1937, the IJA orchestrated a military exercise along the border with the Chinese Republic. However, by the end of it, one Japanese soldier was found to be missing. Even though it was not the case, his brief disappearance was used as a pretext to invading China, accusing the Chinese of kidnapping. So, on the night of the 25th of July of 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War began. In just over a week, Beiping had fallen before defeat of the Imperial Japanese Army. After this first big victory, Chinese lines began falling apart one after another. With the fall of Jinan by October, more Chinese reinforcements of the Nanjing government began flooding the area, stopping the Japanese progress in its tracks. The numerical advantage was on the side of the otherwise inferior enemy. However, they were unable to liberate any territory of value. Seeing no other options, the vast Chinese coastlines were the only viable venue for future incursions deeper into China for the IJA. As the war was now beginning to demand more resources, the military grew in strength and influence. The civilian government has found itself outmaneuvered. Events that were now transpiring within the government paved the way for what would soon turn out to be the last civilian prime minister of the Japanese state, Fumimaro Konoe. In August of 1938, Ningbo was invaded and secured. It was undefended, which allowed for the IJA force to fan out in all directions. In June of 1939, Nanjing was occupied. Throughout the occupied territories, the IJA committed countless war crimes, but their brutality and cruelty soared to new levels in occupied Nanjing. The war began in 1937 with high expectations of this war just being another brief expedition that would last a few months at most. But now it has been going on for 2 years, with more manpower and resources being sunk into the underdeveloped Chinese countryside. Seeing how the civilian government was unable to put an end to this expensive war, the IJA proving itself to be an instrumental asset, this made it necessary to form a new government. This new government was to unite all elites and then the people in an ultra-nationalistic organization, the Taisei Yokosenkai, the Imperial Rule Assistance Association. The military has accomplished its goal of achieving primacy over the Japanese state. In October, the landing forces in the south have connected with the invasion forces in the north. In January of 1940, the IJA proved to be a highly competent force. Not only did the military emerge victorious over the civilian officials, but the army had emerged victorious over the navy, culminating in the premiership of an unassuming but calculating and cunning military man, Hideki Tojo.
戦線のご消直が間髪せられました。精鋭なる帝国陸海軍は今や決死の
Under his guidance, more resources were dedicated to the war effort, as well as increased arrests of political enemies, of leftists, centrists, and even rightists. Nobody was safe from Tojo and the all-seeing eye of the Kempeitai.
马西。
伤得很重。
In June of 1941, the spare capital of China, Chongqing, was put under siege. The city fell, and China capitulated. China lay in ruins, with the puppet regime of Wang Jingwei installed to pick up the pieces. Over the course of this war, many Western countries have sanctioned and embargoed Japan, depriving the empire of many valuable resources. This necessitated the empire to look further southward, where European colonies were rich with all sorts of resources, especially oil. The black gold of modern industrial warfare that makes tanks move, planes glide across the burning azure, and ships rule the waves. However, there was one major obstacle in achieving this goal: the American-controlled Philippines. If everything was to go along without a hitch, this obstacle had to be removed. Thus, the IJN began planning an operation to strike at the United States. Japanese leadership on all levels understood that America is not Russia, and that it is not China. It has vast naval power, and is too far away to be seriously hurt by a strike in the Pacific. Thus, Admiral Yamamoto conceived of a plan to execute a single powerful strike that will cripple the US in the Pacific Ocean long enough for Japan to secure all of its major objectives in Southeast Asia. In the meantime, the IJA began securing territories that will help with future operations, such as Macau and the Tonkin ports. Finally, after many months of preparations, the IJN was in position to execute Yamamoto's plan. On April 3rd of 1942, the Japanese army began its operations along all theaters against the Western powers.
This is no drill.
Members of the Senate and of the House of Representatives, yesterday, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
In May, the Navy was able to secure a safe passage towards Hawaii. Pearl Harbor fell, coming as a shock to American leadership and the American people, with American propaganda swearing revenge, and Japanese-American citizens being rounded up in internment camps under suspicion of being spies for the Empire. In July, Saigon had fallen, with the Western powers being removed from the Indochina region. Japan was now free to focus on the Philippines, Indonesia, and Burma. In August, the Philippines have surrendered. The American General MacArthur, while escaping, promised to return. However, those who were unlucky enough not to escape with him were met with a fate some would say was worse than death.
You are enemies of Japan. You will be treated accordingly.
On October 31st, Britain suffered one of the worst military defeats in its whole history. The symbol of European power in Asia, Singapore, was taken by the Japanese forces. In India, Japanese and Allied forces have reached Indian Bengal. India was very vulnerable now to invasion. In February of 1943, British India had fallen. Now the Imperial Army could focus on fighting its way towards the waters of Australia.
Move up! Keep low!
Enemy troops!
In September, having destroyed Western navies in the area, the IJA was able to land on mainland Australia. Western defences were on the brink, as too many of them were tied up fighting in Europe. With the fall of Melbourne, securing Oceania was only a matter of time now. In June of 1944, the war in the Pacific was won. It was won by the Empire of Great Japan. With the fall of Australia, the Philippines, New Zealand, and the Dutch East Indies, as well as India, the Western powers had no hope of establishing a strong enough naval presence in order to properly contest Japanese hegemony. They had no choice but to agree to peace on Japan's terms. Japan had emerged victorious. Hideki Tojo and his IJA emerged victorious over enemies both in the world and over those at home. Japan now could exploit its empire to its heart's content. Only thing left now was claiming the Russian Far East, which was no issue now that the Russian army was battered and destroyed by constant war in Europe. The Far East was surrendered without a fight, and Mongolia was occupied, brought into the Japanese sphere of influence. The strikes both south and north were accomplished. Japan had finally broken out of the shackles previously imposed upon it by foreign powers. Now it was Japan setting down the rules of the game in Asia, from Australia to Vladivostok, from Hawaii to Pakistan. All bowed before the Empire and her God Emperor. All those who resisted were eventually destroyed by the Kempeitai, which by now evolved into a police of thought, hunting down anyone and anything labeled as anti-Japanese. Speaking out against Taisei Yokosenkai, anti-Japanese. Having a tattoo, anti-Japanese. Speaking English, anti-Japanese. Japan now had its metaphorical tentacles all over Asia. None could now escape its grasp. Now, the only concern for the military government was its purpose in times of peace, as it was established originally to finish the war against China, but eventually got Japan into a war against all odds with the Western powers. But all enemies were destroyed and beaten out of Asia. Now was the time to settle down and contemplate what place does Japan now occupy in this new but still uncertain world, and that of the Taisei Yokosenkai in post-war politics of Japan.